Hey there guys, and welcome back. You know, there's a lot of dovetail jigs on the market and they all have their pros and cons, and I've had several of them. But it wasn't until I got the Leigh D4R Pro that I really stopped looking for any other model. So on this week's show, I'm just going to demonstrate using the Leigh Jig exactly how easy it is to get perfect through dovetails with your jig and a router. So the first thing that you want to do is you want to cut the pieces for your drawer or your box or whatever it is that you're making. With any dovetail jig, it doesn't matter which one you're using, it's important that you ensure that all of your cuts are square. Not just from the edge and the butt joint here, but also this way. If they're not square in every aspect, you're going to have problems with the dovetail joint. The router bit's going to go in ever so differently or off center. Your assembly will be just off square. So it's important to check every board to make sure that the end cuts are perfectly square in every aspect. That's important. That's number one. So we have the pieces for our project here laid out, and basically we've just, you know, set them up in the way that we would assemble them, and then we've kind of knocked them down so we can see what we're looking at here. Now in this particular project, this is a drawer, so for me, I want the pins on the ends of the drawer. And with the Leigh Jig, they suggest a certain type of marking in order to keep your pieces aligned correctly while you are using the jig. So on the outside of your pins for through dovetails, you would make a mark like this. I'll check this and I'll put a picture of it for you. And this indicates that this is the outside of this board. As well, we'll do the same for this piece over here, just to mark the outside of the board. With the tails, we're going to do a different mark, and this will indicate the inside of the board. You can see that the arrow here is pointing to the inside of the box, which would make that the inside of the board. I know it sounds a little confusing at this point, but it really is a simple marking system once you've used it a few times. So now that we have our boards marked for the way that they should be, I will move on into setting up the jig to do our tails and our pins. Okay, I'm just going to run through this kind of quickly for the setup. I mean, this video is more of a demonstration than what it is a tutorial. So just to kind of give you an idea if this is the kind of jig setup that you would like to go for. For starters, in this particular setup you're going to need a spacer board, and it's nothing more than a certain dimension board that just fits in here, and what it does in essence is it keeps or gives a platform for all of these sets of keys to fit on and to sit on properly so that things aren't moving around. So you get that board in there and you clamp it down. Simple enough. At that point in time now, you want to take one of your boards, in this case it'll be the tail board, and you want to bring it up inside your jig. There's a stop right down here, and I'll take some photos and add them into the video to give you a close-up of that. But you want to butt it up to this stop and butt it up flush to the bottom of your jig keys here, and then you want to clamp that board into place. They have these little clamp levers here that work rather well. They hold it in there quite securely without damaging your board. The next thing you want to do is, For starters, ignore this side pin over here. That's just kind of the norm for the through dovetails on this jig. You want to loosen off your jig and just raise it ever so slightly. Raise these keys above your stop board, and that is for nothing more than to give you a little bit of freedom in moving these keys back and forth, because we need to adjust them now. And what we want to do is take this end stop pin and put it approximately 1/8 of an inch from the end of our board. Now I'm using a Veritas setup block here, and I'll tell you right now, I'm just doing it because I have them and I like using them. This is not an exact measurement at all. This is just roughly 1/8 of an inch. On the other end, you want to do the same with this end pin board, approximately 1/8 of an inch from the end. And when you go to tighten these down, just give light pressure on the pin to make sure that it's properly seated. So now we have our two end jig pins set, approximately 1/8 of an inch in from either side of the board. And now we want to take these sets here and just center them between our two end pins. This way we're going to get somewhat equal spacing between our pins and our tails. If you're a little off here, it doesn't really matter. It's not going to be that imperative. Everything works out in the end. Trust me on this one. So basically set them so that they're just to the eye, equally spaced. And then the same thing, a little bit of downward pressure with your fingers and just tighten it up. And then this one here, a little bit of downward pressure and tighten it up. And there we have it. There is our jig set up, ready to go for our cutting section for our dovetails. Now we're going to move on to the next step. There are several modes of setup with the Leigh jig, and we did the setup on the board with this particular plate in the tails mode. It's very easy to see what mode you're in just by looking at the visuals on either end. It tells you very quickly what it is that you're looking at. But we need to route the tails, and the only reason we set this up in the pins mode is, for starters, the screws are on this side for tightening, and second of all, it gives us a really good idea of how we're centered and how things are going to look. So you want to loosen these set knobs on either end, and we basically remove this plate and flip it over, and this now will put us instantly into the mode for the tails. And we've already done our spacing here, so everything lines up for the board. And we want to set this so that the measurement reading here is going to be set at greater than 1 inch. So we'll just slide that into the greater than 1 inch, tighten it down at that point, and then we'd go over to here, greater than 1 inch, and tighten it down at this point. And now that our jig is set up, we're going to get into setting up of the router. And really, this isn't rocket science here. I have this rigid router that I use strictly for the dovetail jig. This is the only thing I use it for, and it's really a shame. I should pick up a second one because I love this thing. It's a great router. But I have on the bottom the E-bushing that comes with the Leigh dovetail jig, and for this particular instance, for these through dovetails, you want to set this bushing here to the 10 setting, and changing it is as simple as locking in this little tool here like that, and then just rotating it side to side, and this here will rotate and it'll set to this marking line right here. But we have this set to 10. Now that we have this set, we need to install the 8-degree dovetail bit that comes with the the Leigh Jig. So we're going to install this, and then once we get this dovetail bit installed, we're going to move on to the next step, which would be, of course, starting our routing. Alright, so here we are under the jig here to the front end, and we have our tail board, and here's the marking that we made on it from earlier, and those markings will face out. And you want to take a tail board and butt it up against the stop on the left side of the jig and tight up to the actual jig pins itself. Once you get it there, of course, lock it into place. Now you want to take one of your pin boards now and place it up underneath. Let me just get my hand out of your way there. Up underneath, like such. And then take a fine pencil and place a mark underneath that board. This line here now that we've made is going to be actually the depth that we're going to set for our router bit. Okay, so we've just drawn our line here to set our bit to, and what you want to do is take your router, you want to place your router on your jig just like such, and you want to adjust that bit until it comes down and the end of this bit is in the center of that line. So for my jig, I actually have one of these, which is the vacuum attachment and router support, and I won't be using it for this video just for the clarity of the video, but that just means I'm going to have a mess to clean up after I'm done with this. But I'll tell you guys, this thing works great. I'll try to get a video of it in action, and hopefully that'll work. But for the first cut here, you're going to see it without this in place. Okay, so we have our first set of tails done, and you could see the amount of sawdust that was flying everywhere. But now, with this marking still outside, you want to flip the board around 180 degrees, put her back into the jig, tight up against the stop on this side, tight up against your router guide, and lock it down. And then you want to route your next set of tails. You're going to route them all. On this one, guys, I'm going to try to see if I can get the vacuum attachment set up, try to keep some of the dust off my camera, and hopefully I'll be able to show you how well that works. So we've got all of our tails routed now, and it's time to mount our pins. So when routing the pins on the Leigh Jig, We don't change any of these finger positions. We've already got those set. But what you want to do now is loosen off your set screws and flip this over to our tails mode. Sorry, our pins mode. And slide it up. And for this here, what we want to do, because of our stock and what it is that we're routing, we want to slide it in to our 1/2 inch to 11/16 mark for the type of stock that we're using. And there is some finagling that goes on here, and for each consecutive thickness of board that you use, you will have to do some test cuts, and then you can write down on a chart exactly what setting to use. Now I've already done that, so I will set this jig to the appropriate guide, and then we will change our router bit to our straight bit, set the height in the same fashion that we set the height of our dovetail bit, and then we're going to route our pins. So in the same fashion that we routed or set up our tail boards, we're going to set up for our pin boards. And you've seen already that I've flipped this rail to the pin mode. From there, we're going to take one of our pin boards, of course with our marking to the outside that we made earlier, identifying which board it is. We're going to lock that board in place. From there, we're going to take one of our tail boards, and again, I'll get my hand out of the way, sorry, one of the joys of being a lefty, and we're going to place a mark underneath here to give us the height, or the depth in this case, of our straight bit. We've got our pin board put in. We have set our jig distance-wise according to the gauge from our test cuts. Again, I didn't go through that procedure. You guys can do that on your own if you should have one of these jigs. And now it's time to route our pins. We have the straight bit put in to our router, and we have set the height in the same fashion as we did for our dovetail bit. And now we're going to go ahead and route the pins. Alright, so a couple tips for you when routing these dovetails. Number one, your dovetails are only as good as your setup. So that's something to keep in mind. Jigs are great, they work fantastic, but if you don't take the time to set them up properly and do a crap setup, you're going to get crap results. That's all there is to it. Secondly, test cuts. Don't just jump right into your final project. Cutting the tails is great, but once you go to cut the pins, you may want to cut your first set of pins on a scrap piece of the same dimensions. That way you can check for fit and check your adjustment. Dust masks, when doing this, are helpful. I'm a dumbass, and normally I use the vacuum setup, and of course this time, for the clarity of the video, I did not and forgot about my dust mask. That's not like me, but either way, now I'm sneezing and I have a runny nose because I've got a nose full of fine router dust. Another tip, guys, of course, is if you are going to be using the router support and vacuum attachment that comes with the Leigh Jig, ensure please before every cut that the router support on the back end is flush and level with the actual fingers of the dovetail jig. I've had it that it's been a little off kilter, and you are relying on that to support your router, but now you're cutting on an upward slope, and that actually changes every bit of your dovetail tightness, and it changes the geometry of the entire project. So please check that. And one other thing that you may want to look into making is, it's off camera right now, but I'll put a photo, is one of these right here, and that's a router support. And it's just a simple little box with a cutout, and I use it when I'm not routing to sit my router on so that I don't have to lie it on its side. It fully supports it, lets the bit hang down in the bottom. Mine's a little high, but of course I was testing the jig when I first got it, and I needed a project, and this one sort of fit the bill. So there you go. And there's a few tips on using the Leigh dovetail jig, and I'm sure you can apply them to any jig that you use when cutting dovetails. And there you have it. Dovetails. From cutting the pins to cutting the tails using the Leigh dovetail jig. There's always been the debate of, you know, dovetails by hand or dovetails by a jig. By the jig is cheating, not real woodworking. You know what, guys, I say if the jig is what you dig, then jig away. Guys, thanks for watching, and I'm going to see you again next week with another woodworking video.